She had 22 years behind her and $94 to her name. And on the morning Bertram Quill told her she was no longer needed, the sky above Heron Falls was the flat, featureless gray of old Dishwater. Nell Fairweather stood in the narrow hallway of the house. She had kept for 14 years and listened to her uncle explain, in his careful bookkeeper's voice, that circumstances had changed. His new wife, Lorraine, needed the back bedroom for her sister coming up from Sudbury. The laundering and household work that Nell had always managed would now be shared between the two women. There was, he said, looking at the wall just to the left of her face, simply no room for a third arrangement. He used the word arrangement twice. He did not use the word niece. He slid an envelope across the sideboard. Inside, he explained, was the sum of $94. 40 of it was what remained of her father's small life policy, which Bertram had held in trust until she was of age. The other 54 was what he called a fair settling of accounts for her years of labor. Nell looked at the envelope and understood, in a way that was almost peaceful, that this was not a betrayal. It was simply the moment she had always known was coming. Finally arriving on a Tuesday morning, with the smell of boiled oats in the air. She didn't argue. She took the envelope, walked to the back room and began to pack. We want to tell you something about what Nell carried out of that house. It wasn't much. A spare dress, a wool blanket, a tin of oats she'd bought herself, and a water bottle she'd owned since she was 12. But there was one more thing. At the bottom of her canvas bag, wrapped in a square of oil-tanned leather, was a draw knife. The handle was birch, worn smooth and dark from years of use, and the blade was long and slightly curved, the kind a craftsman uses to strip and shape the ribs of a canoe. It had belonged to her father, Gordon Fairweather, who had been the finest small boatmaker in the district before a winter fever took him when Nell was 8 years old. She had kept the tool through every year of her uncle's house, through every season of other people's work. She had never once let it out of her possession. Settle in, and we'll tell you why that mattered. Gordon Fairweather had been a quiet, deliberate man who measured things twice and cut them once. He had learned his trade from an Ojibwe craftsman named Joseph Makwa, who had spent 2 patient seasons teaching him how a canoe should breathe, how the cedar ribs needed to be steamed, not forced, how the skin of the hull wanted to be coaxed rather than bent. Gordon passed everything he knew to Nell in the years before he got sick. He brought her into his workshop when she was 5, let her hold the draw knife at 6, and by the time she was 8, she could strip a cedar batten with a steady hand and a clean pull. He told her once, wiping shavings from his apron, that a well-made canoe was the most honest thing a person could build. It has to be true, he said, or it won't float. You can't lie your way through a canoe. After he died, Nell carried his words and his draw knife into her uncle's house, and she kept them both quietly alive through 14 years of dishes and mending and early mornings. She walked to the land registry office in Heron Falls that same afternoon. It was a low-ceilinged room with fly-specked windows and a smell like old newspapers. And the clerk behind the counter was a man named Cecil Dunbar, who had the particular expression of a person who had been mildly disappointed by life and wanted company in the feeling. Nell did not lay her money on the counter. She had been thinking clearly since she left Bertram's house, and she was not about to make a transaction she'd regret. She asked, first, what parcels were available for under $100. Cecil Dunbar blinked at her, as though no one had ever phrased it that way, and pulled a ledger from under the counter with the slow reluctance of a man disturbed from a nap. Most of it was swamp, he told her, rock and muskeg and useless bog. Then he tapped a finger on a map tacked to the wall. A map of the territory north of town, threaded through with the thin pencil line of an old logging spur. There was one parcel, he said, a 5-acre lot at the end of the Ridley Spur, about 12 miles northeast, an old boatwright's property. Workshop had been sitting derelict for going on 15 years. Nobody had wanted it. He named a price of $88, including filing fees, and he named it with the mild contempt of a man who expected her to walk away. Nell looked at the map. She looked at the thin line of the Ridley Spur, threading north through the spruce. She thought about her father and what he had said about building things that were true. I'll take it, she said. She paid $88, kept 6 for supplies, and walked out of the registry office with a deed in her name and the particular stillness of a person who has just made the most important decision of their life and knows it. She spent $1 on a bag of flour, dried beans, a small tin of lard, and a box of matches. She kept the rest. Then she started walking northeast along the Ridley Spur, following the rusted rail line through birch and spruce and the long silence of a Canadian October afternoon. The tracks were old enough that the ties had sunk into the earth in places, and moss had grown up over the iron in long green patches. People in town said the Ridley Spur led nowhere. The logging company that had built it had gone bankrupt 30 years ago, and the timber that had justified its construction had long been stripped from the hills. What remained was a line that everyone had simply agreed to forget. Nell walked it anyway. She found the property the following morning, just as the light turned gold through the spruce. The workshop was a low, rectangular structure built of squared logs, its roof still mostly intact but sagging at one end where a support had given way. The double doors that had once admitted boats in progress were warped off their hinges, and the single window on the east wall had been covered with burlap, now shredded by wind. Inside there was a long workbench along the north wall, dark with oil and age, and the remains of a wood stove in the corner, its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor. The air smelled of cedar and old iron and decades of undisturbed dust, but the bones of the place were sound. The log walls were solid. The stone foundation had not shifted. She stood in the middle of that floor, alone in the complete quiet of the north woods, and something loosened in her chest that had been pulled tight for a very long time. She spent the first day clearing. She swept out the debris and the mouse nests and the accumulation of seasons. She reconnected the stovepipe, found that the chimney still drew cleanly. She made herself a simple dinner and slept on the floor in her blanket, and in the morning she felt, for the first time in years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. On the second day, she turned her attention to the workbench. She wanted to use it, but one end had been built up with additional shelving that had partially collapsed. As she pried away the rotted boards, she noticed something odd about the floor beneath. Most of the workshop had a dirt floor, tamped hard over many years, but directly beneath the collapsed shelving, there was a single flat stone, not native granite like the foundation stones, but a piece of gray limestone, smooth and carefully dressed on its upper face. Nell knelt down and pressed the edge of her father's draw knife into the seam. The stone shifted. She worked carefully, the way Nell Fairweather had taught her to work. No forcing, no hurrying. She levered the stone up with a cedar pole she'd found outside and set it aside. Beneath it was a hollow, maybe 8 inches deep. Inside the hollow was a tin box the size of a bread loaf, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed canvas and tied with leather lacing. Her hands were not entirely steady as she lifted it out. She set it on the workbench and undid the lacing. The canvas was stiff but unrotted. Whoever had packed this had done it with care. Inside the tin, the first thing she saw was a small object wrapped in flannel, a bone-handled folding knife, its blade still clean, the handle worn to a deep amber from years of use. Beneath it was a folded letter, and under the letter, rolled inside a length of oilcloth, was a bundle of Dominion of Canada banknotes, dense and tightly rolled, held with a rubber band that crumbled to dust when she touched it. She counted the bills slowly twice. $360. She sat down on the floor of that workshop and stayed there for a while. Then she picked up the letter. The handwriting was small and even, the kind that belongs to a person taught penmanship by a teacher who took the subject seriously. To whoever finds this place. My name is Ida Crenshaw. My husband, Walter Crenshaw, built this workshop in 1889 and worked it for 11 years until his heart gave out in the summer of 1901. He made canoes here, good ones. He sold them to outfitters and sportsmen and saved what he earned because he was a careful man who did not trust banks any further than he could throw one. I am an old woman now, and my daughter in Winnipeg has asked me to come and stay with her, and I do not have the heart to refuse her any longer. I am leaving this money here because I cannot take it west, and there is no one in Heron Falls I trust to hold it. This was Walter's money, and it should go to someone who will use it on this property the way he would have wanted. If you are reading this, you have already shown more sense than most by getting here at all. Use the money to make something of the workshop. There is good cedar in the valley behind the ridge. You will find it if you follow the creek north from the back of the property. One more thing. If you need help, and you will at first, the way everyone does, follow the old skid road east from the ridge, past the lightning-struck pine. Walk it for about 4 miles, until you smell wood smoke. There is a settlement there called Coppice Landing. It will not appear on any government map. The people there keep themselves that way, for reasons that are their own to explain. Ask for a woman named Greta Mossbank, and tell her Ida sent you. She will understand. I hope you find the workshop useful. Walter loved it here. I think he would be glad it went to someone who came looking. Ida Crenshaw, October 1903. Nell read the letter 3 times. Then she sat with it in her hands and looked out through the broken window at the spruce trees moving slowly in the morning wind. A complete stranger, a woman she would never meet, the widow of a man she would never know, had wrapped up her savings and her husband's last good knife and left them in the dark for whoever came next. Not for a relative, not for a creditor, for whoever had the sense and the need to follow a forgotten rail line to its end. She thought about her father's draw knife. She thought about his saying that a canoe had to be honest or it wouldn't float, and she understood that Ida Crenshaw had built something true here too. A kind of canoe made of trust, left for a stranger on the water. The next morning, she walked the 12 miles back to Heron Falls. She went to the hardware merchant on the main street and bought a new crosscut saw, a set of chisels, clamps, a spoke shave, rolls of canvas for hull skin, and tins of cedar-colored paint. She bought more flour and salt pork and tea and a good wool blanket. She paid in cash, counting it out bill by bill. And the merchant, who had barely looked up when she walked in, watched her with a considerably different expression by the time she was done. She arranged with a freighter named Oliver Strand, a man in his late 50s with a bay horse and a steady temperament, to haul her supplies up the Spur road the following week. He quoted a price that was fair. She countered with one that was slightly lower. They agreed in 30 seconds without either of them raising their voice. Before he left her with the supplies unloaded, he walked once around the building, running a hand along the log walls. "Ridgepole's still good," he said. "You'll want to reset that rafter at the east end before the snow comes, but the rest of it will hold." He looked at her for a moment with a particular look of someone revising an initial impression. "You know what you're doing?" "I'm learning," she said. He nodded once, touched the brim of his cap, and turned his horse back down the spur. She reset the rafter that same afternoon. A week later, when the workshop was clean and weather-tight, and her tools were arranged in order along the workbench, she followed Ida's instructions. She found the skid road east of the ridge, walked it through the balsam and tamarack for what she estimated was 4 miles, and then she smelled wood smoke, and then she heard the sound of an axe. Coppice Landing was a cluster of perhaps 15 cabins built along a fast-running creek, with a saw pit, a smokehouse, a root cellar, the size of a small barn, and gardens carefully put to bed for the coming winter. There were dogs and children, and the sound of a fiddle somewhere she couldn't see. The people who came out to look at her were Métis, most of them. Mixed French and Anishinaabe heritage, 3 generations deep in this valley, with a few families she couldn't readily place. They watched her with the careful, measuring regard of people who had learned not to trust a stranger's first appearance. An older woman with gray-streaked hair and a canvas apron walked toward her. She had the bearing of someone who made decisions. "My name is Greta Mossbank," she said. It was not a greeting exactly. It was an identification, and it asked for one in return. "Nell Fairweather," Nell said. "I've taken over the Crenshaw workshop down the spur. I found a letter from Ida in the floor of the place. She told me to come here and ask for you." Something shifted in Greta Mossbank's face. Not warmth exactly, more like the sound of a well-made lock disengaging. "Ida," she said quietly. "We haven't heard that name in a while." She studied Nell for a moment more, then stepped back. "Come in from the cold." They sat Nell down at a long table in the largest cabin and gave her tea and a plate of beans, and she told them about the workshop and what she intended to do with it. She did not mention the money. She talked about her father and the draw knife and the canoes he had taught her to make. And the people of Coppice Landing listened in the particular way that people listen when they are deciding whether someone is real. It was a man named Duncan Lariviere who spoke first when she finished. He was a compact man with a cedar strip paddle hanging on the wall behind him, and he looked at her steadily. "You can actually build one," he said. "A proper canoe." "Give me the right cedar in 6 weeks," she said, "and I'll show you." He glanced at Greta Mossbank. She gave one small nod. "We can get you the cedar," he said. The people of Coppice Landing had removed themselves from official surveys and government maps 20 years earlier, after a land agent had used fraudulent documentation to push 3 Métis families off their river, lots further south. Rather than scatter, they had moved together into this valley, a place they had always known and the government had not, and built a life that asked nothing from the outside world and offered it nothing to take. They were not unfriendly people. They were careful ones. And over the winter months, they became careful with Nell in a way that was, she understood, its own particular form of welcome. Over the months that followed, Nell Fairweather built 3 canoes. She built the first slowly, working from memory and her father's technique, making mistakes and correcting them, learning the character of the local white cedar, which was slightly softer than what she had worked with as a child. Duncan Lariviere came twice to watch without comment, and then on the 3rd visit showed her how the families at Coppice Landing steamed their ribs, a small adjustment to her process that made a considerable difference to the finished hull. She incorporated it without ceremony, the way Gordon Fairweather had taught her to incorporate any good information, by simply using it. She sold her first canoe in the spring to an outfitter in Heron Falls, who came to see it on recommendation and stood looking at the hull for a long time before he named a price. She countered. They settled. She walked home along the Ridley Spur, with a check in her pocket and something solid and settled behind her sternum, the feeling of a life that was beginning to hold its own weight. On the evening she finished her 3rd canoe, a commission from a fishing lodge, 2 townships east. She sat at the old workbench, as the lamp threw its yellow light across the wood shavings on the floor. 2 things sat on the bench in front of her. Her father's drawknife, its birch handle dark from decades of her hands, and his hands on it, the blade still keen and true. And Ida Crenshaw's letter, folded and refolded along its old creases, the handwriting as clear as the day it was written. 2 women connected by nothing but a derelict workshop at the end of a forgotten spur line. Ida had built the place up with her husband, lost him, and left her savings in the floor for a stranger she would never meet, asking only that the stranger make something lasting from them. Nell had never met her. She would never meet her. And yet here she was, warm and solvent, with 3 sound hulls behind her and cedar already drying for a 4th. She thought about Bertram Quill and his careful bookkeeper's voice. She thought about the word arrangement and the envelope slid across the sideboard. He had given her those things believing they were an ending. He had looked at a derelict workshop on an abandoned spur and seen nothing worth knowing, the same way he had looked at her for 14 years and seen a line item that had stopped being profitable. It had never occurred to him to follow the line. It had never occurred to him that a line, however rusted, however forgotten, was always going somewhere. Her father used to say that a canoe cannot lie. You build it honestly or it fails on the water. Nell set her hand on the draw knife and left it there. The Ridley Spur ran 12 miles northeast from Heron Falls through spruce and birch to a workshop at the end of a line. Everyone in town agreed led nowhere. It led here, to a warm lamp and a level floor and a name spoken with easy respect by the people of Coppice Landing. It led her home. We hope this story found you well tonight. If it stayed with you, share it with someone you think might need it. And before you go, we'd love to know, what forgotten road have you known? What path did everyone around you insist led nowhere, and what did you discover when you followed it anyway? Tell us in the comments and let us know where you're listening from this evening. We're always glad to hear from you.